Hi, it's Josh Goldberg here. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm talking about the labels of personality disorders, borderline personality, narcissism, and sociopathy. Okay, so I subscribe to the way of thinking that these personality disorders are a whatever works best response to severe unresolved attachment trauma from childhood. So I don't believe that any of these three personality disorder labels are a fixed label. And today I've got some real life examples that I was involved in personally that really supports this psychological view that borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and sociopathic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder, whatever you want to call it, are not static, fixed labels, okay? They're not like a set diagnosis, okay? So today I've got some real life examples that I was involved in personally. I just want to share them with you just so you can see that a person is not a fixed label, okay? Even a narcissist is not always a narcissist. So let's take a look at these three stories. So story number one was a real life client case that I had with a couple, and the husband was very well established in a certain community, in a certain area, and he had significant childhood trauma in his home, okay? So childhood neglect, emotional neglect, violence, other forms of abuse in the home. And in the area that they were living in at the time, he was getting a lot of narcissistic supply from his community, from his local support network. And then for whatever reason, the family moved to a remote location. And subsequently, his narcissistic false self disappeared and his narcissistic supply was no longer there. Okay, so without a narcissistic false self, a narcissist will revert back into being a borderline. And this person's wife, was reporting to me that his behavior was becoming much more aggressive, much more self-victimizing, much more into a borderline self-destructive type of personality. Okay, so straight away I can see from this that he went from being a narcissist and he reverted back into being a borderline. And then he actually subsequently went on to heal his childhood trauma because he lost his narcissistic false self. And then he was just stuck with himself, and it was a lot more self-destructive and a lot more self-victimizing and a lot more closer to his childhood emotional trauma. And he was subsequently able to, through a lot of encouragement and support, he was able to go on and to do some hypnotherapy and inner child work and CBT and actually overcome his emotional trauma. And this is why a borderline is able to heal, because they don't have that diversion of a narcissistic false self. Okay, so this is an example of someone that went from a narcissist to a borderline and then was able to find healing from his unresolved attachment trauma and became out of that borderline personality conditions. That's story number one. So story number two is a very unfortunate case that I heard of an old man who was a community leader, okay, a spiritual leader. And I found out about this person that in their childhood and in their upbringing in school, they were quite borderline. They were like an outcast, a bit of a joke, picked on and mocked and bullied, okay? And then after they left school, they became like a bit of a joker, like a bit of a popular person, making jokes, making fun of people, starting to develop a grandiose kind of personality, like a false self of a narcissist. And then he went on to try in a few different communities where he was able to establish himself as a community leader and was heavily narcissistic and basically having a grandiose position in the community, getting respect, getting narcissistic supply from the community. And then in his old age, when the narcissistic supply is not so easy to get anymore, because let's face it, when you're 60 years old, I mean, people that are 60 years old are not quite as charming anymore. They're not quite as influential and charismatic anymore. So he just became like an old, pathetic creep. And because of his inability to get narcissistic supply now, he more or less morphed into a sociopath. And this is when I got involved with a person, and rather than getting narcissistic supply, he was more about irritating people, controlling people, stealing from people, exasperating people, being very overbearing, and getting a lot more of his supply through irritating and extorting and basically trying to dominate other people. Very sociopathic, stealing. Okay, so this is another example of how someone that started out as more of a borderline and self-hating turned into a narcissist, okay, was able to establish a narcissistic false self. And then when the narcissistic false self wasn't performing so well anymore due to old age, the narcissist then became a sociopath and started basically exploiting other people and annoying and frustrating other people as a ego defense mechanism. Okay, so here's another example from borderline to narcissist to sociopath, and this is the timeline of this particular person. So the last story I want to share with you is a case that I heard where a woman was divorced and she moved to another community in another country where she was able to establish a narcissistic false self. So before that, she was heavily borderline, and in her previous marriage, she was very self-loathing, self-destructive, very much borderline behavior. And when she moved to a community in another country to restart, she was able to develop a narcissistic false self there. And then when she got remarried, she tried to uphold this narcissistic false self, and that marriage only lasted about a year, okay? And that partner that she had left her, okay, divorced her, and then she became more or less a psychopath, okay? It was very much about revenge. It was about character assassination and very aggressive, very psychopathic behavior, okay? When she was left by her new husband, and then I think she went on to move on to yet another community where I'm guessing she would have tried to establish yet another false self. So here's another example of someone that was married and she was borderline, moves to another community, establishes a narcissistic false self where she was living for a few years. She gets married. The narcissistic false self starts to struggle in this marriage. She gets left, okay, the guy abandons her and leaves her and divorces her. She becomes a psychopath, maybe because her narcissistic false self completely deteriorates. When she gets divorced, okay, it's a big narcissistic injury for her. And here's another example of the different states that a person can go through as they progress through life. So here's some examples of this, and also through my own personal experiences in relationships, I also saw, living with two borderline women, that a person can go through these 3 different personality disorders within 24 hours. And I'll give you an example, okay? So a borderline person can be very self-loathing, self-destructive, very heavily victim mindset in the house. And then when they go out to just say a function with other people, the borderline can put on like a bit of a false personality even in public settings, okay, in public functions, because most borderlines have very high amount of social anxiety. So in order to, I guess, avoid that high amount of social anxiety, sometimes they can establish a false self in public. And then when this couple are back in the house, okay, she comes back to being in a borderline. And if they have arguments and he, says that he's going to leave or whatever, then she can become a psychopath. So a borderline can become a narcissist for short periods of time when they go out into the public. A borderline can also become a psychopath at times when they have huge amounts of abandonment anxiety and can become severely aggressive and trying to harm the other person physically and emotionally and assassinate their character and to defame their reputation. So these are just some examples of how borderline personality disorder, narcissism, and sociopathy are not set personalities. Okay, each person is a totally different person, and each person can be a mixture of all of these three personality types: borderline, narcissist, sociopath. So if you're dealing with a person that does have severe unresolved attachment trauma from childhood and have confusing behaviors, they may not be just one of these labels, okay? They could be a narcissist in public, they can be a borderline in the house, they can become psychopathic at times. There's a huge combination of things that they could be, and this is the approach that I subscribe to, that these labels are really not fixed, they're not set. Each person can have different stages of their life where they are totally different personality disorders, depending on what works best for them at the time. If they can establish a really good narcissistic false self, then that's probably what they'll do. If they're getting good victim validation through being a borderline and through being an outcast, then they might do that for a period of time. Or if they can't get narcissistic supply and they are wanting to, punish the external environment, then they can even become a psychopath or a sociopath, extorting people, irritating other people, and getting their source of trauma supply through this type of sociopathic behavior. So this is just a quick explanation. Hopefully it's been helpful. If you have any questions on personality disorders or any relationships that you're in that are confusing or tricky, please feel free to reach out. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content. I post regular videos on self-work and relationships. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.